The GOP nominee for a record third straight time, Donald Trump wraps up the Republican National Convention days after someone tried to assassinate him. He spent the week celebrated as a hero by his supporters.
So tonight, with faith and devotion, I proudly accept your nomination for President of the United States.
The impact of the former president's speech to his base and to the entire nation. Plus, President Joe Biden has vowed for 3 weeks that he will stay in the race no matter what. The calls for him to step aside have crescendoed. What's the future for the Democratic Party? And Jacksonville's budget proposal is under the microscope. Revenue increased, but there are major cuts coming to an area the mayor called a priority. Chris Hand joins us on This Week in Jacksonville. Thanks for being with us. It has been a breathtaking week in American politics and something so many eyes have been riveted on. Government law attorney Chris Hand is with us today, our Hand on Government show that we do. And Chris, the Republican National Convention concluded late this week. A lot of focus on that. How did Republicans do given the circumstances following an assassination attempt and everything that's going on in the other party? How did they do focusing on Republican issues?
Well, Ken, as you say, it has been an unprecedented week. Just 5 days before former President Trump gave his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention, he was the victim of an attempted assassination in Butler, Pennsylvania. So really remarkable kind of the span of events that have happened in those few days. Usually there's several goals for any national political convention. One is to unify the party. That clearly happened at this week's Republican National Convention. Unlike 8 years ago when Donald Trump was nominated for president, the first time there were no signs of dissent, no speakers like Ted Cruz did in 2016 telling delegates to vote their conscience. That party is 100% united behind the ticket of Donald Trump and Senator JD Vance of Ohio. So that mission was accomplished. I think they also set out with the goal of sort of toning down some of the issue messaging they had done in the past on issues like abortion and other cultural issues, and replacing those with some conversation about inflation, some of the immigration issues they've talked about, issues that they perceive to be effective in appealing to those undecided voters who haven't chosen where they're going to be in this presidential election. And then, of course, at least the first part of former President Trump's acceptance speech last night was very personal, talking about the assassination attempt, how he felt, how he perceived it. I think that part of the speech was probably very effective. So in that sense, there were some differences from past Republican conventions.
So I want to show you some of that. President Trump all week at the RNC when he would enter the room, and this is from Thursday night. But even Monday when he first showed up, and it was a hero's welcome for the first time that we had seen a public appearance by the former president after that assassination attempt. I want you to hear, just 1 minute into his speech, Donald Trump absolutely leaned into that idea of unity and healing for the country.
The discord and division in our society must be healed. We must heal it quickly. As Americans, we are bound together by a single fate and a shared destiny. We rise together or we fall apart. I am running to be president for all of America.
And Chris, as we heard some of that, again, just 1 minute into a 92-minute speech, the first third of the speech had that kind of tone, and it was riveting to hear his recounting of the shot fired and what happened with Secret Service and everything like that. But then the last hour, that turned into more of the tone that we've heard from President Trump over the last 8 years plus. Did that effectively do what he was just talking about in that soundbite? Did that reach out and say, I want to be president for every American?
I think the short answer is no. It was really a tale of two speeches, Kent, as you say, that very powerful first 15 minutes talking about his, the terrifying experience for him and for the other attendees at that rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. But as you say, at that point, the former president sort of pivoted, and it was very similar to the types of speeches that voters have heard at other Trump rallies, other Trump speeches in the past. So in that sense, it really didn't sort of turn the page. Now, he did only mention current President Biden only once by name, but a lot of the rhetoric was sort of similar to what we've kind of heard before in Trump's speeches. I think also the length of the speech could be an issue long term. I did some calculations, Kent, and it is shorter to drive from the WJXT studios to Gainesville, Florida, than it is for the time it took President Trump to give that entire speech. People watching politics tend to have shorter attention spans. That was the longest by a big amount acceptance speech in history. So I think he probably lost some, even with that powerful beginning, probably lost some of his audience going forward, both in terms of the length and in terms of the messaging.
One of the big events this week with the RNC was Senator JD Vance becoming the nominee for vice president. So the 39-year-old providing a chronological contrast to the 45th president because he is exactly half the age of Donald Trump. Ideologically, though, Senator Vance spoke Wednesday night in what amounts to an introduction to the voting American public. Here's part of what he had to say.
President Trump represents America's last best hope to restore what, if lost, may never be found again. A country where a working-class boy born far from the halls of power can stand on this stage as the next vice president of the United States of America.
And so what's the role of JD Vance in this as the vice presidential nominee, and obviously the big difference, 39 years old versus 78?
Well, I think this was there was a lot of speculation about who former President Trump could pick. He went in the direction, I think, sometimes you see some balancing either ideologically or geographically in some of these picks. I think what you saw here was former President Trump sort of doubling down, picking someone who believes in his philosophy, could sort of serve as a bridge to a next generation of that philosophy, perhaps looking to the future. As you say, JD Vance is 39, Donald Trump is 78, but really showing the grip that Donald Trump has on the Republican Party at this point, and also, I think, recognizing the importance of the Rust Belt as the swing area. That's where JD Vance is from. Obviously, he became famous by writing Hillbilly Elegy, a story of his growing up in the Rust Belt, and Donald Trump very specifically said when he picked him that he was doing so in hopes of being able to connect with states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Minnesota. That was right in the statement. So I think there's both an ideological component, wanting to have more focus on the Trump philosophy, and also a political component as well.
All right, so we're going to turn more specifically to the Democratic Party when we come back. What is the future for President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, other key Democrats? That's our topic next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
And Chris Hand is with us today, and we're going to talk specifically about what's happening in the Democratic Party, what seems to be an historic crisis. And let me set it up this way. The Biden campaign says there may not be a debate between the vice presidential candidates. A spokesperson released a statement this week saying Senator Vance won't participate. Here's the statement. Donald Trump is the one whose campaign said he would debate anytime, any place, and who picked JD Vance specifically for his debating skills. This debate has been discussed for 2 months now. If JD Vance is unwilling to defend the Trump-Vance record on the debate stage, he should just say so. Well, here's the question, Chris. Why would Republicans wait on this? Because it's unclear at this point who's going to be the vice presidential nominee.
Well, that would be one, very important reason not to agree to a debate until you know who you're actually debating in this case. And as we know, that is uncertain right now. While as of this moment, Joe Biden is the presumptive Democratic nominee, there are more and more calls for him to step away, not run for a second term, and make way for a new nominee, in which case there will be more than likely a different vice presidential candidate. So I don't think the Trump campaign's decision to wait on that is all that surprising under those facts. What we really have in terms of a juxtaposition between the two parties right now, Republicans, as we just said in our last segment, got through a pretty unified convention, seem aligned. The Democratic picture is much more cloudy right now because, again, while President Biden has indicated he plans to continue forward with this campaign, there's a growing number of Democratic, particularly elected officials, who have said they want him to make a different choice. And there was some polling this week, Kent, that said that 65% of Democratic voters want the president not to seek a second term, but instead to move forward.
And let's show you some of that. There was this Associated Press poll, and I think this is what you're referring to. I mean, almost 2/3 of Democrats surveyed say that they want to change at the top of the party's ticket. 65% of Democrats saying President Biden should withdraw, allow the party to select a different nominee. When we've heard from President Biden these last 3 weeks, when he said, no, I'm all in, and when interviewers have said, well, what would change your mind? Part of that response is, well, if I knew there wasn't a way to go forward. Is that what is being proposed to him, or trying to persuade him to maybe step aside?
Well, there's been a bit of a moving target in those responses. At one point he said, God Almighty would have to make that decision, then said it'd have to be some sort of physician's diagnosis, now saying it'd have to be convinced that somebody else could win. So I think that's part of the evolution of the decision-making process. Look, this is very hard. This is a very hard thing for a sitting president of the United States, one who was elected in 2020, to make the decision not to run again. I think the data that's coming together, some of this polling, hearing from elected officials, and let's not forget, Kent, what the most central question is here, which is under our Constitution, we elect a president to serve for 4 years. And I think what that last debate performance brought up was the question of whether that was possible with the current president. So that's why you're hearing from a lot of these elected officials. We'll have to see how this evolves, but there is a stopping point to it. The Democratic National Convention starts on August the 19th in Chicago, goes through August the 22nd. Democrats will have to nominate a president and a vice president at that time. It is unclear as we sit here today who those candidates will be.
Well, and what we've seen late this week was even a scenario where if President Biden retired or stepped out of the race, just said he wasn't going to run for re-election, that kind of thing, that there might be an open convention, and he wouldn't endorse. He wouldn't say Vice President Harris must be the nominee, that kind of thing. How could this play out?
Well, it could play in a couple of ways. One, as you alluded to, there does seem to be some thought that a logical replacement would be the vice president. She was elected just as the president was on that ticket in 2020. In that scenario, she would step forward as the Democratic nominee, be confirmed by the convention, and she would name a vice president. The other way to do this is, as you say, have a totally open convention. Give every potential presidential nominee the chance to compete and win the support of delegates. Whoever wins a majority of the delegates at the convention becomes the presidential nominee, and he or she then gets to pick their vice presidential nominee. So, that calls back memories of the 1968 convention, also in Chicago, and conventions from even many years before that, where open conventions were more of the norm than they are the rarity in this case. So we'll have to see. I think Democrats want to, if possible, come together behind some sort of plan because they don't want to keep seeing stories about Democrats in disarray. That sort of time, that oldest time story that we've seen. If it's not going to be President Biden, if they can come together on a ticket now before the convention, have the convention confirm that ticket, that certainly calms concerns about some of the disarray people have been discussing.
So it's not a done deal that President Biden won't be the nominee, but if he's not, I would imagine Democratic leaders right now are working through the possible scenarios, which candidate would stand a chance against this Trump-Vance ticket.
That's correct. I think that's exactly what's happening. Trying to coordinate and communicate with President Biden about his wishes and his plans and be ready with a plan B in the event that he decides to step away from the campaign.
Certainly lots of Democrats who support President Biden. Want to know, if this happens, is there a way that it can happen in a respectful way, or a way that provides him to do this without feeling like he's been pushed aside?
I think that would be everybody's preference in this case. Look, Joe Biden has a more than 5-decade record of leadership and public service in this country as a U.S. Senator, as Vice President, now as President, has a long record of accomplishment, a real patriot who served the country well. I don't think anybody wants to see him pushed off the stage or pushed out of the arena. I think everybody who wants to see the president replaced on the ticket or wants to see him step aside would like to see that happen in a respectful and dignified manner that befits his service. But a decision will have to be made by that August 19th to 22nd convention. So we'll have to see if the president does make the decision to step away, and if he does, what the Democrats decide from a nomination standpoint.
And we'll move on here. We'll go to a commercial after this. But just that idea of what you recommend, 1968. The year I was born. I don't remember an open convention. So that idea that it sounds like a free-for-all and sounds really interesting from a political observer's perspective, but just kind of unheard of for our generation for sure. All right, so stay with us, and we are going local next with a deep dive on the budget proposal in the River City. Stay with us on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
Chris Ann served as Chief of Staff in the city of Jacksonville from 2011 to 2015. And so, Chris, let's talk about the most recent budget proposal from Mayor Donna Deegan. And on our show, she told us, hey, there are going to be some hard decisions, but help us understand some of the finances here. City revenue increased, overall budget went up, but then as we sort through this, how can this be a crisis or a tough time to put together a budget for the city when revenue's going up?
Well, Ken, just to give you a little perspective, during the 4 years I was at the city, we actually saw revenues go down for 3 of the 4 years, and in the 4th year they went very slightly up. So
that
this
sounds like a tough time to do a budget.
It is, and this is a very sort of different experience. Luckily, the city's in a better place now than it was then, but it's there are kind of 2 budgets we often talk about. One is the operating budget, the so-called general fund. That budget the mayor has proposed is $1.92 billion that the city will kind of spend on its various...
That'd be a record, right?
Well, that's right. And that reflects about $73 million in new additional property tax revenue. The city was expecting more than that. It was expecting about $135 million in new property tax dollars, but because of changes in the real estate market, they didn't get that full amount. They got about $73 million to spend on extra priorities. So that's one part of the budget. The other part of the budget is the so-called capital budget or infrastructure budget, known as the Capital Improvement Program. That's how the city invests in infrastructure like streets and sewers and sidewalks and other infrastructure and capital projects. The money for the stadium comes out of the capital budget, stadium renovation. So that budget is about $489 million this year. I know we'll get into a little more some of the different components of that budget, but important for people to understand the process to the extent they want to engage in it. Under our charter, the mayor just proposes a budget. The body that has the power to actually enact a budget and set the millage or property tax rate is the Jacksonville City Council. So the proposed budget now moves to council to make changes and actually pass a budget before the start of the new fiscal year on October 1st.
And that happens through various committee meetings and analyzing and probably some amendments, and let's reshape this before it gets to September, right?
That's exactly right. What will happen is in August, the council has a series of public hearings on different components of the budget. The council is assisted by the City Council Auditor's Office, a team of very professional, experienced city finance experts who help the council work through that process. They'll have a series of public budget hearings. I would encourage any citizen who wants to voice their concerns, questions about the budget, that would be a very good time to do so at those public budget hearings where there'll be opportunities for public comment. As the City Council Finance Committee, which is chaired by Ron Salem, who last year was the president of City Council, as they work through the budget, recommend changes and send a recommended final budget to the full council for consideration.
Chris, one of the things you pointed out is that the mayor's talking about making up some of that lost revenue, getting $47 million out of the city reserves. That sounds like that may not go over that well with City Council.
Well, so just to give people a sense of what that is, the city, like any organization, keeps money on hand for emergencies and other unexpected expenses. Those are the city's reserves or their emergency reserves. What the mayor is proposing doing is spending $47 million of those reserves on a variety of one-time expenses. That practice of using reserves on day-to-day expenses has usually been something that both the council auditors and the council themselves have been skeptical about. Various budgets have used some amount of reserves. This is a significantly greater amount than you normally see. So Council Finance Chair Salem has already said that's something he has concerns about. We can expect to hear more about that as we go through the hearings.
We know there are some costs going up. 40 new police officers in this budget, increases for police and fire and corrections salaries, budget increases for that contribution to UF Health Jacksonville. Maybe explain that for folks also.
Sure. Well, again, you talked about 40 new employees there. You know, as we know, the mayor and her team recently reached tentative agreements with the police, fire, and corrections unions that will lead to very significant pay increases this year, somewhere between 12 and 15%. So all of that is in the expense side. Also, the city is doubling its contribution to UF Health Jacksonville. As everyone knows, that's the public hospital, the level 1 trauma center here in town. It's actually city-owned. It's administered by the University of Florida. The city's making an extra $27 million contribution. That's on top of UF Health Jacks also got a $15 million contribution during the recent legislative session. And the legislature recently approved a provision that would allow the city to ask voters to pass a special sales tax to benefit public health, which would benefit UF Health Jacksonville. So between all those different sources, UF Health Jacksonville receiving a variety of types of budgetary assistance or potential budgetary assistance.
So we're talking about some of these, the way places costs are going up.
Yeah.
It sounds like in this budget proposal, arts and culture getting cut. And we've got about a minute and a half left here.
Yeah, sure. So this has been something the mayor and her team have articulated as a priority, investing in arts and culture. And in last year's budget, they provided over $8 million for what are called cultural council grants. Well, this year's budget cuts that amount to below $7 million, it's a cut of like $1.2 million. Particularly significant this year because, as you know, the governor, when he was vetoing funds in the state budget,
a big pile of money,
vetoed every dime of state money for arts and culture grants, which had about a $2.6 million impact on Duval County arts and cultural organizations and affected them throughout the region as well. So I think some of the concern might be that after the governor's cuts, this is now an additional cut at the city level for arts and culture organizations who already were experiencing some fiscal concern as a result of that. I'm sure that will be a discussion in the council hearings on the mayor's proposed budget.
And something will follow too with some of those leaders from arts and cultures here in Jacksonville, because we know that, and you pointed this out to me, every dollar awarded to arts and cultural organizations produces about $32 in economic impact. So certainly something that we will continue following. Always love to get your perspective on such a wide variety of issues and then your expertise. Chris Hand, thank you.
Kent, good to see you.
All right, so This Week in Jacksonville, we air each Sunday morning at this time. I'm Kent Justice. So thank you for watching on air on Channel 4 and the CW17. And then online at news4jax.com or streaming on News4Jax Plus. And a reminder, check out This Week in Jacksonville Business Edition. The episode of our podcast this week looks at Downtown Investment Authority. It's our interview with CEO Lori Boyer. You can find new episodes every Thursday at 9 a.m. You'll find it right now on News4Jax Plus under the channel This Week in Jacksonville.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.